China's street vending stalls have returned. Will they bring a new economic vitality? US cancels ban on Chinese airlines after China eases rules for foreign carriers. And this week's newsmakers. Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. In response to the serious economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, China has encouraged people to set up open-air stalls to create more employment opportunities. The policy is being introduced to help relieve the pressure on job creation in 2020. To help us understand more about the new development, joining me via satellite is Wang Dan, an analyst with the Economist Intelligence Unit. Welcome to the show, Wang Dan.
Thank you.
So we know that the street stalls was actually banned in a couple of years ago in big cities in particular for the problems it brings about with the practice. Now the government at different levels is welcoming the back of street stalls. Why the change?
This year is very special. It is probably the first year that China will see its unemployment rate breaching the 6% psychological threshold. And for the Chinese government, it's very important to create a lot of jobs and fast because the people, the groups are affected the most are the migrants, urban poor, and it's very difficult for the economy to get back on track in time. So it is very convenient, actually probably the fastest way to just let them go to the street and set up street vendors.
Mm-hmm. Well, very, nice introduction about the problems and what the government is doing to resolve the issue. If you look at the development on the ground, for example, in Chengdu, important big city in southwestern part of China, the city has set up at least 36,000 such stores as the end of May, creating jobs for at least 100,000 people. Of course, this has won the applause for Chinese Premier Li Keqiang during the two sessions just concluded in Beijing. So if we call it like a model in Chengdu, can the Chengdu model be introduced or be copied by other cities in other parts of the country?
I think the enthusiasm among all the big cities in China is pretty high, and we have already seen similar moves in Beijing and in Shanghai. But for this move to become sort of a new trend in China, it also will take a lot more from the policymakers. Something has to give, because those street stalls, they will create noise, they're fire hazard, there will be product quality problem, so there has to be some sort of rules for those street vendors to follow. And as far as I can see, that it does create a lot of jobs, but at the same time, probably it will be relatively difficult to generate the growth that the government want. So for local government, they might not have enough incentive to push this too quickly.
But at least it resolved the issue of, say, joblessness. If you have increase of these unemployment rate in whatever cities or in provinces, there is a pressure, specific pressure on the local governments. But if you see increasing number of people now is basically sustaining their life by employing themselves, isn't it a good thing? Isn't that enough incentive for them to support the new practice?
It will be an amazing thing for both sides, actually, for the workers who don't have enough income and also for the local government. But now the problem is China is a very different economy from 30 years ago and also from 20 years ago. The economy now is so diversified and people can get anything from online. There is no real demand that they must buy something from the street vendors. And that creates this problem that the street stalls might provide some temporary income relief for the poorest group in China, but in order to generate some reliable income, it is not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, this is happening during this special situation. On one hand, you want to see the return of the economic activities to the normal level. But on the other, you are on the job still, obviously, against the possible new outbreak of the COVID-19. So how to prevent and control the spread of the coronavirus while developing street economy, let's say, here?
It will be a very big problem because social distancing has to be in place in order for this COVID-19 to be under control. But for nightlife to be effective nightlife and for those street vendors to survive, you actually can't implement it at a too strict level. So I think there would be a big role that the hospitals and local medical workers can play. There need to be enough tests and also enough cleaning in the area so that they can ensure the consumers and also the sellers that it is safe to do this kind of business.
But that will create more jobs, right?
In a way, yes, I would think so.
Well, of course, if there's a boom, at least in Chengdu and some other cities here, in street stores, then people will ask a question whether the booming business of this, small vendors somehow impact the businesses of like a brick and mortar stores, as well as like e-commerce development, as you touched upon a little bit, previously here.
I don't think so, because for physical stores, they're selling different things. It's a different product quality, and they're targeting different consumers. So there is a kind of consumer loyalty there associated with a physical store. But for street vendors, it's very hard to establish this kind of relationship. It's mostly just a one-time purchase. And I can imagine in big cities like Beijing, it's probably mostly for entertainment, a nice nightlife, maybe after-work walk with a family. But for this business to be sustainable and to compete with online business, it has to do a lot more, like maybe an easier refund. That's something you can trace, but it's very hard to do.
Well, you mentioned, I think, like a lot more to support such a, let's say, street stores here. For example, the latest development in Shandong province, East Coast region in China. Basically, the local government said that, for the small business and street stores, they are not going to impose any taxes on them, at least temporarily. Is that a strong incentive for people somehow, to develop or to, set up their own stores, for example?
It is a big incentive. At the same time, there has to be also a lowered fee for them to set up the store. As far as I understand, there is an amount that you have to pay up front, and it's not very cheap. Also, for the urban planners, this is a new challenge because, as we know, that China's urbanization is very clean. And for those street stall vendors to go there and, in a way, polluting this grand, clean city, there would be some pushback from the policymakers on the city and provincial level.
Well, some say the return of the vendors has brought back much needed vibrancy that was thwarted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Is that the case? And how much can this policy support for street stores help with economic recovery, given, people's spending power also being affected by the COVID-19?
I guess this is one of the silver linings that brought upon by the COVID-19, because previously people cannot use the public place like the street, the sides of the street. But now, because of the coronavirus, then they somehow get part of the user rights back to the citizens. And this, in a way, is very liberating. And for many of the city dwellers, this is important because it feels nice to live again, rather than some very concrete, very harsh life in especially a big city in Beijing, very wide streets, very busy life. So although I don't think this would be a long-term solution for either urban planning or economic growth, this would be a very good way to bring back the life to its citizens.
Well, let's move on to the relationship between the two largest economies in the world, China and the U.S. So adding to the tension over trade, high-tech, and COVID-19, the restoration of regular flights between China and the U.S. seems to have presented another headache in bilateral relations. As most of the countries in the world started to emerge from the pandemic, international flights gradually come back to life, although in a slow and restricted manner. China has adopted such a policy while trying to strike a balance between restoration of economic activities and prevention of the COVID-19 disease. But it seems China and the U.S. somehow they don't see eye to eye on how the flights should be operated. To have a closer look at the issue, also joining us now from Chicago is the U.S. political commentator Laura Schwartz and Mark Wise, a retired American Airlines captain and the president of Wise Consulting Group. Welcome to our show. So, Laura, I'll start with you. The Trump administration on Friday scrapped a plan to ban Chinese passenger airliners from flying to the U.S., where the new order limits Chinese carriers to 2 weekly flights to the U.S. Why has the ban, which was just announced on Wednesday, and now been lifted?
Well, I believe there were conversations between both countries, the United States and China, with the bilateral airline agreement, and Mr. White can speak very well to that. The United States absolutely is using their position against the political policies being impacted by China on Hong Kong. This is, in effect, a pushback because of that, as well as on tech and trade, as we find ourselves, going back to the basics of the trade agreements that were nearly implemented before COVID-19 began. So it's absolutely, definitely has a lot of political motivation, again, stemming back to the new policies enacted on Hong Kong from mainland China.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Wise, I mean, the flights, the resumption of the flights itself is also a technical issue too, right? Because, countries want to do it in a gradual and a slow manner, because at the same time, you also have a task to continue to fight the possible spread of the virus.
Well, yes, and your previous guest here is absolutely correct. It's a multiple component. It's a political component as well as a epidemiological component. I mean, we've got to be concerned about the health of the passengers, the health of the citizens from the point of view of the airlines at both sides. And again, here in the United States, you also have to recognize, yes, there is pushback from the president, whose policies have been ramping up against China for a while. We've seen that before.
Mm-hmm. Well, why is the U.S., which has voluntarily suspended its flights to China, I think in the middle of February, so now somehow we see the eagerness from the U.S. government to increase its flight access into China, Mr. Wise?
Well, I think what you want to see, what you're seeing is a push by the U.S. government to get to the bilateral agreements that have been signed back in 1980, where there's a number of flights back into China, that the number of airlines coming from China to the United States, they want the same number of flights going into China. One of the ways that I think really could help is, for instance, Beijing's got a beautiful new airport that is not slot restricted, at least at this point. Here's an opportunity for China to open up even further and to show the rest of the world that we are open for business, we want you, with the same idea that you must keep health-conscious people in mind, that this is really a pandemic that's scored the earth, but we do want you to come, and if you can flow them in without slot restrictions into an airport like Beijing, that would be a big help, and it will show the rest of the world that you are more open than what may be coming out in the press.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Chinese aviation regulator said in its latest statement that foreign airlines currently unable to operate routes to China can actually choose one city in the country from which to run international flights once a week, which means U.S. flights will be able to access China. So, Wang Dan, is this a response to the U.S. ban of Chinese flights? Some would say this is a Chinese concession to the U.S. pressure.
In a way, I have to say there is an element there that China has to give something back to the U.S. Because the U.S.-China relations has been worsened further since the COVID-19, and this airline competition is just a reflection of that. But I don't think China can give the U.S. truly what it wants, the favorable treatment, because that will put China in a very disadvantaged places when it deals with other countries' airlines.
So the U.S. side is seeking preferable treatment, basically, more flights from U.S., back and forth between U.S. and China, but somehow still limited practice between China and, say, European countries or Japan or South Korea. So that would make China in a very difficult position. Mr. Weiss, what do you say about that?
Well, it's a very awkward situation. I think that the United States is trying to push the issue. Remember, this is an election year here in America, and the history of our president and China, the relationship is not a very positive one. And I think what he's trying to do is also show and flex his muscle to show that to his base supporters, look what I can get done. The reality of the situation is, at least from my perspective, is that China needs to be more flexible, as well as the United States. This has to become a win-win situation for everybody. And that can't be just in the short term, but it's got to be in the long term. And again, it's a political component and a medical, a health component as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of the long-term relationship and also a big picture of this relationship. All right, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer recently said that he feels, direct quote here, basically, very good about the purchase of the Phase 1 trade agreement with China, which is honoring the pact amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And then on that, Trump said, I will say China is buying a lot from us, and in that way, I respect, and getting along with China would be a good thing. Then on the recovery from the pandemic, President Trump said, we are working with the world, and we will work with China too. We'll work with everybody. So what do you make of his remarks?
Well, there's been quite a bit of mixed messaging when it comes from the Trump administration and China. Often we can see that fluctuate with the president's polling among his own party and his base supporters especially. As you mentioned, we're just under 5 months from the presidential election. Trump has called it oftentimes, this is the plague from China, the China virus. And so he does think that looking tough on China will help him with his base as he's seen his poll numbers slip. On the other hand, in another direction, I should say, is that as we open up the United States, as we still are carrying more infections than others, and we're trying to figure out how to open up each state and discuss regional travel between states, in the same way we do have to look to opening up the world when it comes to the epidemiology and the spread of the virus. We could see very clearly how it spread from the beginning around the world. We have no borders when it comes to this pandemic, and so safely enacting worldwide travel is definitely something that needs to come into play as well.
Right. One time, if you look at the next less than 6 months' time before the general election in the U.S., China has become the major topic, unfortunately, in a very negative way. So what do you expect of the bilateral relationship during this few months to come?
I'm not too optimistic about the future of the China-U.S. relations because the nature of the bilateral relation has changed since the U.S. labeled China as a competitor. And we have seen an escalation throughout the trade war over what China should and should not do and how it should deal with the U.S. in terms of technology competition, financial competition. And before the election, I think the Trump administration, also Biden, they would use as much as the China bash as possible to win the favor of their voters base, and it will be a very powerful weapon to them.
Well, back to you, Laura, here. We know Mr. Biden has been officially nominated as the candidate of the Democrats. So far, he is ahead of Mr. Trump in the, multiple polls to show that. So how optimistic you are, like Biden will win the election? And under a Biden presidency, What do you think about, U.S. relationship with China?
Well, first of all, with the impending election, Joe Biden and Donald Trump have been very close in national polls until about March, April, when Joe Biden has really taken a lead. At some points, 5 points, as much as 10 points over Donald Trump. But it's really the state-by-state polling that we are looking now towards, since we are within the 6-month time frame before the election. There are critical states in which Joe Biden needs to win that Donald Trump won last time, and he's really making strong gains in those areas. So it is looking positive for Joe Biden, but as we know, these change on a daily basis. Joe Biden, however, now that he is the official nominee, getting the correct number of delegates to clinch that just yesterday here in America, he now will lay out and roll out his policies, and both with China and against China's political reparations with Hong Kong. So that's something that's going to be more of the conversation as we go forward, not just on trade, technology, and finance, but also about Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. Well, the death of George Floyd has led to intense nationwide protest in the U.S. with calls for police accountability and questions on civil rights and entrenched racism in the United States. So, Laura, why have there been so many cases? I mean, George Floyd is not the first time you see a black male got killed in the hands of the police. Like it's a repeat of these tragedies. Why is it?
Well, it's very interesting. This is something that we've seen too much of. During the Obama administration, there were demonstrations of this as well with a gentleman named Eric Garner and Michael Brown, after which the Obama administration put into act 21st century policing guidelines and training coming out of the Federal Department of Justice, overseen by his Attorney General. Not that it should take all the blame, but the Trump administration has rolled back the funding and stopped a lot of those programs. That doesn't mean that the state and local officials shouldn't take them up on their own. There are absolutely different pods of policing units around this country that have shown excessive force, police brutality, and just the other week murdering an innocent man named George Floyd in Minneapolis. This has been leading to a lot of action locally and state. The members of Congress right now, the Democrats hold the House but not the Senate. So even the different concessions that the Democrats want just haven't been able to get through. But on a state and local level, community policing can change. And in fact, just a few nights ago, the Minneapolis City Council issued a ruling that chokeholds and certain neck maneuvers are no longer allowed. You will not be protected as a police officer for employing those techniques. And a civil liberty suit was filed against the police department from the state. So there are changes. It is systematic, but that's something that, with George Floyd, we call attention to once again and need to break down.
Mm-hmm. Well, one then, of course, those technical changes, for example, in terms of the police conduct when they are dealing with anyone, not only the African Americans, for example, no chokeholds, as introduced in Minneapolis, it will help. But again, if you look at, a lot of people watched the video when George Floyd was killed. You see in the police, the eyes, or in action, there's disregard of life. Disregard of the life of George Floyd. So there's something more than, say, the policing or the technical issue. Do you agree?
Yes. When I watch that video, one cannot watch it without feeling the rage inside. It is really difficult to imagine that Derek, that's the police killing Floyd, he knew that several cameras were on him, and that is one of the policing reform since the 2014 Ferguson incident, that the policymakers believe that with a body camera, the police can be in a way contained. But actually this guy, he knows all the cameras are on him and still went on to do what he thought he's entitled to do. That has caused me to think there is a psychological level, a psychological health issue in this whole policing reform thing, because those people, they're dealing with shooting, murder, all sorts of incidents on a daily basis, and there is not enough funding for that. And on top of that, there's also another obstacle that from my research, I found that the police union is forever present. It is really difficult for any meaningful reform to be pushed forward because for Democrats, they're afraid of offending the union, and for Republicans, they're concerned of offending the police. So over the past 5 years, there was basically no other fix other than this technology fix with the body camera, and that is really sad.
Mm-hmm. Well, according to the data, from the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, nearly 23% of reported COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. are African Americans as of late May. I mean, even though black people make up roughly 13% of the U.S. population. So, Laura, obviously there's an inequality in terms of the health issue. I guess it's also inequality issue about economic income here, let's say.
Yeah, there's quite a few factors at play that are currently being researched and investigated when it comes to COVID-19 and the disproportionate effect that it's having on Black America. Some of those factors are the comorbidity factors of higher hypertension rates and diabetes rates among Black Americans. More Black Americans are frontline workers, U.S. Postal Service, home health care aides, transit drivers, grocery store clerks, and they're on the front lines. There's also a higher housing density among black communities as well that affects the spread. The Democrats asked the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, back in March to start breaking down COVID-19 death rates by the demographics of race. And it wasn't until late April they started reporting on that, and not every state is reporting out on it. So I am happy to see that Senator Harris of California has introduced a bill to establish a national health equity task force. We know that because Black America still does not have the same access to education due to cost and location, healthcare, cost and location, and jobs as well, there's more at play than health because it's like a three-legged stool. And without education, healthcare, and jobs working together for the community, it just can't stand. This is definitely calling new and renewed awareness to the issue we've all seen, and it's time, and Joe Biden definitely is going to work on that to earn that black vote for the upcoming election. And then the real challenge is implementing the policies that are going to make the change.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned about awareness. What needs to be done very briefly, to really truly create this environment and awareness that the black lives do matter, like in 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
investing in education, giving more grants and transportation to schools, and investing in more healthcare clinics with technology that Black America can access in their communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. With that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can follow me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next week.